Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have Martin Refalo back on the show. 6 months ago, he came on and we discussed a paper where he'd just got some of the first results through from, and he ran us through the methods and a few of the things that he saw happening already in terms of results, but couldn't say anything too strongly to anything there. But it was very exciting because this is a study that's really filling some gaps within the kind of current state of evidence in the literature that's out there and available. I think a lot of people think that we know much more than we necessarily do, and this paper that he recently released has really helped fill some of those voids that we have and give us a lot more confidence in some of the things that we're doing. And it's going to also pave the way for a lot more research. So Martin does a fantastic job here of really explaining why he has the certain methods that he has, what the results were, and then how you as a trainee or a coach can take these results and apply them to your current thinking about proximity to failure within your programming for hypertrophy. So guys, I think you're going to really appreciate and enjoy this chat. We went into a lot of detail, and clearly Martin has worked really hard on this study, so just show him some love and appreciation in the comments or sharing it around. That would be greatly appreciated. And as a reminder guys, at Revive Stronger, we are coaches. That is what we do, online coaching. We help individuals whether or not they want to get to stage, bodybuilding stage, a photo shoot, or they just want to lose some fat, gain some muscle, feel better about what they're doing, and build some confidence and knowledge of how to apply some of the principles that you hear within this podcast to their hypertrophy training, and maybe even help them become a better coach if they are one. We work with a lot of coaches. We really try and have great communication with our clients and develop a fantastic relationship. So you will not feel like you're just getting a PDF and email check-ins. We very much take a lot of care over our communication through video diaries and things like this. But you can learn more about our online coaching and our team through the link which will be in the bio that goes to our website and our online coaching if you did want to check that out at some point. But without further ado, let's get into the chat with Martin. So Martin, you were on about 6 months ago, and that was episode 373. People might want to refer to that episode because there's a lot of relevant information within that one that we're going to be talking about today, because you just finished collecting data for the first kind of cohort, the first round of the study, and you just recently now fully peer-reviewed and published this study that is now fully out there. And you were looking at the difference in muscle growth between either taking sets to around a 1 to 2 RIR. It was actually pretty precise. We'll come on to that. And leaving or taking things to failure and kind of seeing muscle growth and changes there. So before we dig into like the juicy paper and the outcomes, many will kind of think of, and I had Zach Robinson on the podcast and had the meta-regression that he and his colleagues, and I know you're part of that paper, they would have thought maybe we have like a clear picture of RIR and the implications for hypertrophy and that relationship. So I think it would be useful to start with why your paper is particularly powerful and why it maybe fills some gaps that we have within the literature at the moment.
Yeah, so this paper really is 3 years in the making. I still remember, planning it tentatively 3 years ago. And as my ideas developed, obviously the study design itself developed. Steve, I think we spoke probably 2 years ago as well about my initial scoping review on this topic. And that was my chance to critique the literature, identify research gaps, and actually do something about that. So, identifying gaps and limitations is one thing. Trying to do something about it is another. And the point of that scoping review was to almost, build a runway for the rest of my studies to fly off and hopefully, future research to fly off too. So since then, we've had so many more studies in this area published. We have studies now that use RIR prescription and, intraset RIR predictions to investigate outcomes. We have more data on RIR accuracy, which I think is important. We've also been able to explore, the dose-response relationship for the first time. And although there are limitations to that, we have a better idea of how estimated RIR is related to muscle hypertrophy. So really, this study is kind of the icing on the cake for all that. Of course, there will be more studies in the future that provide us with an even deeper understanding. But when it comes to this particular journey, where, prior to my scoping review, all we really knew was there's no statistically significant difference between failure and non-failure. That's all we knew. And that led to certain claims and thought processes that I don't think are as accurate as they could have been. And I think since then, people's ideas surrounding proximity to failure have improved. And I think that will eventually, over time, carry on to practice and hopefully hit even more and more people. I think proximity to failure is, as a training variable, is like increasing in the hierarchy of importance. But what we need to understand is, in our evidence-based circle, that might be the case, but there's still so many people out there who terminate their sets at a certain number of reps, for example. And this is something I wrote about recently in my PhD thesis in the introduction. If you look at fitness magazines and you look at some of the programs that in these fitness magazines, like you'll see exercises listed and sets listed and just a static number of reps. So although in our circle, proximity to failure is increasing in its importance, I hope over time, the wider fitness community will also start to realize that, hey, instead of just prescribing a set number of reps or a rep range, we also need to give people an idea as to how, these sets need to be terminated in regards to like intensity or proximity to failure, or how hard sets need to be terminated. There's many different ways you can spin that. And it's cool to see the findings of this study, reach more and more people, because I think the methods that I've employed allow for stronger conclusions. And this is really important to understand. Knowledge just generally needs to be considered relative to the methods used to build that knowledge. So oftentimes we, read conclusions and findings in research papers, and they might be really appealing to us, and we might spread that knowledge, and that's cool. But just because it's appealing, and even though the claim or the statements in those conclusions are accurate, even if they're accurate, they still always need to be considered relative to the methods employed. And what I've done with this study is, over the past 3 years, is I've tried to come up with all the gaps, all the limitations that I can see in this research, and think about ways that I can feasibly design a study that moves, this area of the literature forward. And of course, I can't do everything in one study. I'm not going to change the world with one study, but my goal here is to try and, set a bit of a foundation for future researchers to build on, right? At the end of the day, especially in exercise science, like one experiment can't really verify or refute a theory. It's only going to weaken it or strengthen it. So again, one study isn't going to change the world, but it provides us with more clues that we can add to our database of clues. And over time, as better and better studies get published, of course, our understanding is going to grow, right? So all knowledge in science is provisional. We need to understand that. And as studies build within this relevant literature, our understanding of proximity to failure will only improve. And I'm really, really looking forward to seeing that over the coming years.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really great intro to it. And as you kind of put it out there, it makes complete sense. And we did have that scoping review. I wish I had the number of the episode for that, but people have to search your name and they'll find the scoping review where, yeah, you identified a lot of holes that I don't think, I think some researchers even would have been abundantly aware of it to some extent, but like the people like myself who I read some research and I listen to science communicators and I try and digest this and stay on top of it. But I wasn't as acutely aware of it because my finger's not on the pulse of that. I'm kind of mostly coaching people. So when you talked me through it and I was like, oh, okay, so there's really no great definition for failure. And a lot of studies are estimating these RIRs and they're not even differentiating between which RIR we're even at and how accurate are people's RIRs. So I know your study was the first intervention study to assess and report participant RIR accuracy prior to the study commencement and prescribe RIR as a set termination method, allowing individuals to terminate their sets with an intra-set RIR prediction. And that's very ecologically valid in terms of how I go into the gym and do my own sets, or how anyone listening, if they are using RIR, would be doing it. So when people are looking over, at least the way I felt about it, I was like, this is how I would go about my training. It isn't. Whereas when you look at maybe other papers, it's just not as clear. So I think you really have set the stage for a lot of future research too.
Yeah, no, it's really cool to hear that from you, Steve. And as someone who reads research quite frequently, especially for your podcast, like I'm interested in just hearing your thoughts generally about how the study reads and how it really all comes together. Like I've seen comments and most comments have been positive, but I haven't really asked anyone yet. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the things that I'm less able to understand and appreciate are the statistics. So like the Bayesian models and bits and pieces like this. I think you need a full education in that area, and I haven't spent the time doing that myself. But in terms of like the things I'm really interested in are hearing about, okay, what was the program? What exercises were selected? Who was the cohort of people that were being studied? And what was their trainee experience? So you actually gave quite a lot of information about even the people being the trainees there. And then things like, hey, what is their nutrition and how much detail do we have about that? And you even gave like, okay, this is how much weight they gained. These were their average macros. Like it's all these bits of information that as a coach, I'd be doing with my clients and kind of tracking and monitoring. And I know they impact results. So I think that was really valuable. And then the really cool thing I think you guys did was, because it was a within subject design. So you had one leg doing failure and one leg doing the other protocols, like the things we know really impact results, like sleep, genetics, like nutrition, although kind of but within a single person, that's all kind of taken care of for you. So you don't have to stress about it. So it just, we were talking off air and I was like, it was really well received, or at least you were letting me know that, and I'd noticed that too. And I was like, yeah, there weren't many. I often will look ahead of time in the comments to see if there's anything I want to cover within the podcast, because people sometimes have questions. And I was like, hey, nothing really came up because as the title was, or the thumbnail at least, for the 6 months ago, that podcast, it was like you wanted to produce a bulletproof study. And it's hard to find any, it feels very watertight. It feels pretty bulletproof. It was hard for me to identify anything that I was like, could that have impacted anything? Which just gives extra confidence in the outcomes and results from the paper. So really good.
Yeah, that's cool to hear, Steve. I was quite anxious about the comments that might have come through. But it's been overwhelmingly positive so far with some great questions. And yeah, the statistical side of things, I understand, can be tricky to get your head around. And I think that's completely fine, because you do need education in that area to understand it. So it's fine for you as a practitioner to focus more on the things that matter mostly to you, like the training protocol, the nutrition control, the RIR accuracy stuff. I think most people should spend most of their time, reading and understanding those aspects of the design, and then listening to podcasts like this, where I might actually go into the statistics to some extent and help clarify a few things. So I'd be interested in doing that at some point today as well, because there is a slight difference between the Bayesian analysis, or it's actually quite a large difference between the Bayesian analysis and some of the standard statistical testing that you might come across in other studies.
What I will say is, at least with that, the statistics and also measurement tools, you did a good job in the paper of explaining why you selected the ones you selected. It wasn't just we used Bayesian and this was the outcome. It was like, this is why we've chosen this specifically, because it's going to allow us to get further insights and probably give you a better reading of actually what's going on. And the same with the measurements. The reason you did that was to have more confidence in the results that you were producing.
Yeah, totally.
So I don't know if where we want to go from here, particularly if before we will jump into kind of those elements, if we want to jump into like some of the methods. I know we ran into some of them like last time that you were on, but for just like a brief recap so that people listening kind of have a good comprehension of it.
Yeah, I'm all about methods. So, like I said, knowledge needs to be considered relative to the methods employed. If you read through the methods of the paper, you'll notice that there's quite a few words in there, and that's because I just think it's so important to understand again how a study is designed when you're trying to extract conclusions from it. So, in the last podcast, I did speak through some of the important points, and we can do a slight recap here too. I think the first one that I do want to clarify and hammer home is the within subject design. So I did receive a few questions about the design of the study, and like you mentioned, Steve, in each individual I compared their left limb right to their right limb, left leg to right leg. So there's pros to that comparison. One of them is that within each individual, I now have 2 data points. So it basically doubles your sample size. In research, it's quite hard to recruit individuals. So that is already a big win when it comes to sample size and statistical power. The second one, which you also alluded to, is the fact that that comparison in itself takes care of genetics, nutrition, sleep, stress, and the possible differences in those factors between individuals. Steve, if I compare you to me and you're training failure, I'm not training to failure, who's to say our genetics, isn't going to influence the overall outcome, right? Or the fact that I might be sleeping 5 hours a night and you're getting 10 hours of sleep a night. As a researcher, I can't control everything that you do in your day-to-day life. I can control some things, but not all things. Now, the main concern has been, well, how you train one side of the body, how you train one limb might influence the physiological response in the other. That's been the main question, right? How does that idea influence the results of the study? And what we know about this cross-education effect, right, whereby training one limb has an influence on the other, is that neural drive does transfer from one limb to another. So in studies where one limb is immobilized and the contralateral limb is trained, we'll see strength development in both sides of the body. And that is a pretty concrete finding across many studies. But when it comes to muscular adaptations, so now we're speaking about morphological changes, right? The anabolic pathways that lead to those morphological changes in muscle size don't seem to carry over from one limb to another, right? So there is likely little to no cross-education effect of hypertrophy, which means that when you're looking at hypertrophy, the within subject design is a very robust design. And if you want to know more, there's a great paper. Stuart Phillips is on this paper. He's the principal investigator there, I believe, investigating human skeletal muscle physiology with unilateral exercise models when one limb is more powerful than two. Check that out, have a read through it, and you'll better understand, why the unilateral model is quite powerful. So that's one thing. Moving on from that, there were multiple other factors of the study design that I think are quite significant. And we spoke off air, Steve. I remember I was in Spain for a conference and I was on a train ride, and I had this little notebook. I was planning my study, had a little graph of how the study was going to look. And I was thinking about all the things that could make this study a stronger study. Thinking about all the comments that I often see on social media about, relating to concerns about study designs and limitations. Just trying to plug some holes. So, if you read through the methods, you'll see that, for example, with the ultrasound scans, I had two ultrasound scans, at pre-intervention and two at post, right? So 2 and 2. Now that allowed me to calculate the error margin of those ultrasound scans. So when we speak about the results, I can speak about changes in muscle thickness relative to the error margin that we had with our ultrasound assessment. So I can say, hey, these changes are actually likely due to hypertrophy as opposed to just measurement error. And the fact that we did two ultrasound assessments in the post-training period means that the changes are unlikely to be due to like sarcoplasmic hypertrophy or fluid retention in the muscles from training, because we did two, which were already like 72 hours away from the last training session, and those two were 48 hours apart. So we're now speaking like 6 to 7 days after the final training session. So something to keep in mind there. Of course, nutrition, Steve, was controlled by virtue of the study design, the unilateral design, right, as we've just spoken about. But we also monitored it, right? So I teamed up with the guys from Macrofactor, so big thanks to them. The participants were assigned to a certain calorie and macronutrient intake that would hopefully lead to an increase in 1% of body weight per month. And they had to track that. That's reported in the paper. I've had a few comments. Eric's been coming to bat for me in the comments because we've had a few questions about the nutritional control of the study. And, we had one person mention that the range of body weight change is so large. They said, well, how is nutrition controlled if, the body weight change in men, for example, range from like 0% basically to 10%? Yeah, how is it possible that nutrition is controlled? And what we know there is that people simply gain weight at different rates. There's a great study by Levine from 1999 that shows at 1,000 calories above maintenance, some people will gain like 7 kilos, others will lose weight. It varies a lot. That's one thing we need to understand. Another thing we need to understand is a lot of that initial gain is likely to be due to water, gut mass, because some people may have been eating at maintenance prior. Some people may have been in a surplus. Again, we can't control for everything. We just had people start. They were assigned a certain calorie intake. They started consuming, that number of calories. So there's obviously going to be variability there. But at the end of the day, we ensured that everyone was eating sufficiently to grow, which, we seem to think is important for at least a resistance train sample. They were consuming enough protein. And I think it's really cool as a practitioner to see that reported in the paper. It's not often that I even, come across nutrition variables reported that way. So hopefully, that's appreciated by practitioners who are interested in these things. And then from there, some of the other main things about the methods, the most highly trained sample of participants in the relevant area of research. So when we're looking at studies that compare failure versus non-failure or different velocity loss thresholds, this was a very well-trained sample of individuals, and 50% of them had experience competing in strength or physique sports, so powerlifting or bodybuilding. They all had experience with RIR, which is important to keep in mind, hence some of the accurate RIR predictions, which were tested prior to study commencing. And again, this is the first time this has been done before a long-term intervention, right? So although I don't know, Steve, how accurate the participants were during the intervention, because I couldn't test them every single set.
Yeah.
We did the assessment prior. They were about, on average, 1 rep away, less than 1 rep away from the RIR target. There seemed to be like trends for overestimation as you predicted closer to failure. So with the 1 RIR prediction, the trend was to overestimate that and go closer to failure, right? Whereas with the 3 RIR prediction, the trend was to underestimate it. I think that's a really important practical takeaway. Like if you're working with clients and these trends might exist, you're prescribing RIR, maybe you just prescribe one lower then maybe you prescribe closer to failure than you otherwise would if you know that someone might underestimate at a 3 RIR. Maybe you give them a 2 instead of a 3, right? So something to keep in mind there. But that was tested prior to the intervention, and that gives us some confidence. We know that, okay, on average across the intervention, it's likely that participants were around 1 rep away from that RIR target. And again, you can almost think of this as a proof of principle study. This is showing that using RIR prescription and making predictions can be effective. Now, I'm not here to tell anyone to use that approach. I don't think everybody needs to be using RIR prescription. I definitely think it has its place here and there. I don't think everyone needs to use it though. And it's just providing some evidence for its efficacy, right, in resistance training programming that aims to promote muscle hypertrophy. It can work. It can work pretty well, but at the end of the day, it's just a tool. Like in practice, RIR prescription is a tool. So although we have this study that shows it can work pretty well, in practice, it always comes down to how it's coached, right? So I'm not here to tell anyone that they should be prescribing RIR to all their clients, because how you coach it, how you teach it, how you speak about it to your clients, and the timing at which you introduce it in their coaching journey is important, right? Yes, if you have a new client come through and they're very well trained, they've got some experience with RIR or RPE, well, they fit the bill of this study, right? They fit the rough sample that was studied. So you can probably be pretty confident that using an RIR prescription is going to work well in that case. But there's cases where that might not be evident, right? So something to keep in mind there. And lastly, I'll finish off with the fact that we didn't deliberately equalize training volume between the protocols, which I think is important. And people will often say, well, hey, in exercise science research, they equalize volume. And that's not ecologically valid, right? Because in practice, you don't ever think about equalizing volume in practice or restraining yourself, do you, Steve? You just train and you experience a certain drop off in reps, or maybe you don't, and you accumulate a certain amount of volume and you move on. So in research, the reason we sometimes equalize volume is to tease out the effect of certain variables, right? And there's always trade-offs. If you do that, then you have greater confidence that a certain variable is having an effect, and then you might say, hey, it's likely that the effect we're seeing here is due to frequency, for example, not volume, because volume was equalized, but then you lose that ecological validity. In this case, we didn't equalize volume between the groups, so we could observe the effect of proximity to failure on volume accumulation. And I think, the findings there are important, and they obviously have practical applications too.
Yeah, I think that was very well said. And I think even if you had tried to equalize some of the volume in terms of like volume load or reps, it would have probably made it less powerful of a study, because at least the way a lot of the listeners will think about volume now is just sets. So the sets were the same. It's just your and part of kind of the reason why we might use reps in reserve is because of fatigue and rep drop off, and do we accumulate more volume load through leaving some reps in reserve. And this is something we can talk about, of course. Actually, something I did just flung into my head as you were talking, because you mentioned when people were aiming for that 1 RIR, they often overshoot and maybe even kind of get to failure. You weren't measuring it during the protocol, but did you ever see people on the leg extension, which was targeting a 1 RIR, did they ever go to failure? Did you see that in person? Did that happen?
That's a good question. Yes, I did. And I saw it a handful of times on the leg press. I think less so on the leg extension. At least it's more obvious on the leg press, because it just always is. So I think the beauty of that is, again, it applies to what we do on the gym floor. I'm sure there are moments, Steve, where you're aiming for a 1 RIR or even a 2 RIR, and you just happen to overshoot it. Like it might just be, sometimes it's just a mental block in the gym. Other times you back yourself in and it's just not there, right? We don't always have someone by our side yelling in our ear, pushing us to do that extra rep or helping us get through it. That's not everyone has the opportunity to train with a training partner. And of course, in that case, you might actually get through that final rep. But in the study, I let the individuals terminate their sets on their own accord based on the RIR targets. There were a handful of times where failure was reached on the leg press, so participants overestimated, and less so on the leg extension. This isn't something that I recorded because I don't think it matters too much. Again, this was a proof of principle RIR prescription study. This is RIR prescription. This is how it works. This is how it plays out in practice, right? We don't even know in practice how accurate we might be. We obviously want to deliver it to people who we think can be pretty accurate, but at times they're going to overestimate and push harder than we need them to at any given moment. Sometimes they might underestimate, and that's cool. Over time, we just want to evaluate the effects of that approach, and that's what I did. So I don't think we should be scared of overshooting or undershooting, right? We just need to believe in our abilities, push hard, and see where that takes us. And that's what I did in this study. And I think for that reason, it also increases the ecological validity that we've been speaking about.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely done it. For some reason, it happens a lot on pressing movements for me, like bench pressing movements. I end up overshooting my RIR, and I'm like, damn it. Yeah. I just have overconfidence in some things. I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to micro-load that. Yeah, exactly. Like you said, it's not necessarily a bad thing as long as you're not kind of unnecessarily risking injury or something. It's something you can just manage like you will with your clients. Hey, they tell you they overshot. You're just like, all right, maybe we back off a rep next week, or maybe you'll have it next week. You can kind of see it as it comes, and you can adapt to these things, which actually we'll probably talk about a little bit as well. And something I did want to mention, just because I thought it was cool to see, was with the training. It was interesting to see rather the rep ranges selected, but I think they were selected for a reason, where you had 8 to 10 kind of rep range goal for the leg press, and then 10 to 12 for the leg extension, which are, I would say the leg extension, that's a bit on the low side. Well, they're both a little bit on the low side, I guess, maybe. Yeah. So I'd like to know kind of what the reason was for that.
Yeah, I have a pretty straight answer to that. When it comes to the exercise selection and the repetition range or the loading range, the considerations there were mostly practical. So the leg press and the leg extension, I know there's a slightly off topic of the question, but they're quite common exercises to be performed. That's one thing. They were available right in my gym. I can easily track lifting velocity on the leg press. They're stable exercises which allow you to push closer to failure with less concerns. That's why I chose those two exercises. When it comes to the loading range, what I was trying to do there is reduce the level of perceived discomfort that the participants might feel. Now, in practice, I will usually program a little higher than 10 to 12 on leg extension, like totally. But to try and reduce the perceived discomfort and the potential of that influencing, the RIRs reached and the RIR accuracy, we tried to keep the rep ranges on the low side, and also to just reduce total participant burden. Obviously, more reps, more metabolic fatigue, longer time spent in the set. A lot going on there that may have harmed the participants' adherence, possibly, and their ability to gauge their proximity to failure. So try to keep it on the low side for those reasons. And I still think they're ecologically, valid rep ranges, but in practice, of course, there's definitely room to move.
Yeah, I think I read that I have the notes down that the reasons you just explained there were explained in the study, or maybe you said it on the last podcast. I can't quite remember where I kind of picked it up, but I just thought it was when they were explained, I was like, it makes complete sense, especially like the RIR accuracy. And then, I mean, everyone knows above 15 reps on leg extensions is, let alone the exercise, but leg extensions in particular, it's people call failure like when the burn kicks in, and it's like, okay, yeah, that could confound some results or reduce accuracy. So that makes a ton of sense to me. And I even liked you included like a supplementary list of like exercises that people couldn't do. So you particularly picked the quads because it's quite easy to isolate those, whereas like biceps, triceps, if people are doing pushing and pulling within their program, it's going to impact results, obviously.
Exactly right.
But yeah,
exactly right.
you excluded even like deadlifting off the floor and hip thrusting, which I guess include like the smallest amount of quad, but enough that you were like, please don't do those.
Yeah, that's a good point because I did have a few questions regarding the muscle groups um, investigated here, and again, really the answers are very like practical. It's like it's just hard to study other muscle groups, especially ones in the upper body, like the arms, for example, without greatly limiting the participants' training outside of the study. And remember, when you're working with resistance trained individuals, like these guys don't really want to be changing their training up too much. It's like they're happy to participate in the study, but they also don't want to compromise their own training. So, as a researcher, it's like there's every decision you make comes with trade-offs, and uh, you can try your best again to control for these variables and move things forward. But there's still always going to be, some holes in the research, which is fine because then future research can aim to fill those holes.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And again, on every research paper and then researcher I talk to, I start to appreciate these things, and they're things that I think you probably really appreciate, and you understand exactly why it's done a certain way. So it's great to learn that, and I think it's good for the listeners to kind of learn that as well. And something else, I don't think we've mentioned it, but you took into account previous training volume. So in terms of number of sets, it was based off what they were previously doing, and they came into the study doing that number, unless they were over 15. And I think you said you reduced the set number by 20%. And was that based off, I think, previous experience of people just getting a bit messed up when they're coming into such a hard training study and doing such high levels of volume?
Yes, that was more of an ad hoc decision because I had one female who came in doing a high amount of volume, and I think one of the sessions took like 2 hours.
Oh,
So
God.
again, practical decisions there. So yes, if they came in with over 15 sets for their quads, we reduced it slightly, but then it went up by 20% anyway, halfway through the intervention. And for the remainder of the participants, yes, I looked at their previous training routine. The number of sets that they were doing for their quads was simply carried over into the study, which means that participants were doing a varying number of sets. But remember, based on what we've spoken about, that's fine because of the within subject design. Okay. 20% increase halfway through the intervention, just to add, slightly more stimulus there, seemed to work pretty well, seemed to induce hypertrophy. And importantly, I think I think it's a good time to get into the statistics just briefly here. Don't want to spend too much time here, but I think this might be important. With Bayesian analysis, basically what we're doing is we're trying to estimate the size of an effect, its probability, and its uncertainty. Okay, now as a practitioner, those words should mean more than just there's no difference between two groups, right? So we're estimating the size of an effect, how much of an effect does this protocol have? What's the probability that we're actually going to experience that effect, right? And then what's the uncertainty like? How's it going to vary across people? That's what we're doing here. And when we're creating these Bayesian models that provide us with these estimates of the effect, we can account for certain variables. So what I mean by this is, although the within subject design took care of the varying sets between participants, within the Bayesian model, for example, that provided us our estimate for change in quadriceps thickness, we made it account for the number of sets that the participants were doing. Right. So basically what we're doing in this model is we're saying we want to know the change in muscle thickness. We want to know whether it is different between protocols. And we want that estimate of the effect to account for X, Y, and Z. Right. So, for example, number of sets performed, baseline muscle size was another one, right? Because that might influence the potential for hypertrophy, etc. So within these models, right, not only have we explicitly tried to create methods that are robust and, a study design that accounts for differences between individuals, like we've explicitly tried to do that, and you can see that written in the paper. But what you don't see are the implicit procedures that we've employed, right, to try and handle these issues statistically too. So within the models, we're accounting for these variables. So when we speak about fatigue and repetition loss, etc., Steve, the higher the number of reps you do on your first set, right, the larger the possible loss. Okay. So in the model that estimates the effect of repetition loss or even lifting velocity loss, it takes into account the number of reps on the first set for every individual, for every set in the whole study. So you can imagine what the Excel spreadsheet looks like for that, right? It's like, and how much time it takes to extract that for each participant. So in the model, right, we're looking at number of reps, performed, and a whole bunch of other things within the protocol that we think could affect the outcomes. And then the result that we get is an estimate. So, we might have, for example, a raw change in muscle thickness of just, for example, 2 centimeters. That might be the raw change post takeaway pre. But then when we put it into the model and we get the Bayesian estimate based on all the factors we think might affect it, it might be like 2.2 might change because it's an estimate, or 1.8, right? So it's no longer the raw measure based on the given data. It's now the given data, which is inserted into the Bayesian model, that it then accounts for certain factors that we might be interested in, and it gives us an estimate. And when you see those probability distributions, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing the estimated effects based on whatever we think might actually influence the results, right? And then that probability distribution, that's the likelihood of different outcomes occurring. And you can see, where the mean point is. You can see that that's the most likely outcome. You can see, the uncertainty there by kind of the width of that distribution. So when you understand that, you kind of look at those graphs and you can make some intuitive sense of those graphs, which I think is a important element of the Bayesian analysis. And hopefully, people understand that.
Yeah, it's unfortunate we don't have the graphs that I can just plaster on here, but you actually did a couple of reels over on Instagram, in fact, where you talked through some of these models and things. Yeah, they were really good. And I think I actually had a couple of people reach out to me and just commenting on the study and saying how the graphs really helped them grasp the information. So if people are struggling with anything you mentioned there, if they pull up the paper, which I'll have linked in the description, they can kind of have all the materials there and they can look at the graphs and again, kind of get a better understanding and feel for what you're talking about there. But again, it just adds, I think, further confidence in the outcomes versus just taking the raw data at face value, because, there's a lot of things that could impact that.
Yeah. And like, if you're a researcher or just someone simply interested in the statistics, everything I'm speaking about is in the supplementary file, right? You can see the exact factors that we have put into every model, right, to account for the model to account for those factors. And all the code used for the statistical analysis from A to Z is uploaded online. You can see a step-by-step overview of every procedure that went into the analysis. And the reason that I've uploaded that is so people can literally, if they're that interested, they can read through it. And future researchers, if they're interested in the methods we employed here and the way we presented the data, like, they can grab that code, they can copy it over, put their data set in, and basically replicate the statistical analysis with minor changes based on whatever they need. So again, if you're interested in that, it's all online.
I appreciate that. And actually, you also sent me it, and I had a look at the videos, because there's also videos of one of your participants performing a set on one leg to failure and then on the other leg to the RIR. And I actually had quite a lot of people reach out to me, and they also wanted to see it. And I was sharing the link around with a bunch of people reviewing it. And I just, again, it's something that people ask for. It's one of those questions on social media, like they want to get a better insight into, like, was it really momentary muscular failure? And now it's like, hey, I actually have videos of some people performing this.
Yeah.
And I just credit to you, Martin, for going to that next level of transparency here.
Yeah, I appreciate hearing that. It's important for people to know that it is hard as a researcher to do those things. So just to give you some insight, I coached every session, right? Like, I was there for every single session. It was like 400 sessions that I did across all the participants. I had to watch every set. I had to count every rep. I had to literally monitor the exact like time period between each of the sets and make sure people go when that 4 minutes is up. I had to write down the data, right? I've got like hundreds of papers here, just full of data that I was writing down as I was going throughout the session. Like there was just so much happening throughout that session that I had to take care of. I don't have someone following me around with a camera, so I couldn't get full footage of all the sessions, but I tried to get some footage that has been asked for. I know Jeff Nippard. I have a vague memory of Jeff Nippard making a post, and I think you might have tagged me in the post a while back about just the fact that we should be able to see, some of the training that is happening in these studies. So I tried my best to get some footage. And again, I hope people can kind of use that as a bit of a confidence booster here when it comes to the robustness of the study.
Yeah, I'm just picturing you with those 400 workouts now, and it's not like you can't miss a rep, you can't redo a set. Like you have to be there and present for all of that.
Have the clicker every rep, timer on, the gym aware. That's another thing. So for the lifting velocity measurement on the leg press, it's like I'd have to have a gym aware going, and I have to make sure I press start before the set. Not every session, but in certain weeks I have to do that, which adds a spanner into the works. And this is all whilst trying to be smart with time. It's like, got to be on it so that the session doesn't take longer than it needs, and we're not having longer breaks. We've got to be on it, and I'm sure it'd be easier if you had a team of researchers. I'm always envious of the guys in Florida FAU, because I speak to Zach, I speak to the boys there, and they've got such a good team, and it seems like they all help each other out with the research, which is cool. I'm in a position where I'm kind of heading it all myself here. So it does make some of these finer details a little bit harder to manage. Yeah. But tried my best there.
You also mentioned something just that adds to the ecological validity here is the 4 minutes rest between working sets on the leg press. You had 2 minutes rest between working sets of the leg extensions, and 5 minutes between exercises. These are just small things that I really appreciate reading, because I don't know, you see some studies and it's like, oh man, I would never do that in the gym. Not to say that all studies are trying to be ecologically valid. They're definitely not.
True, yeah.
But it just gives further credibility here. And again, if people are interested in those finer details, they can definitely kind of look up the paper and have a read through. But I just thought I'd mention it because you said it. I don't know if there's anything more on the statistical analysis you wanted to dig into, or we could actually dig into the results here.
I'm sure there is, but I think it's fine to dig into the results. So I guess we can start with quadriceps hypertrophy. So if you look at figure 3 in the paper, like if you're listening to this podcast, you can take some time later on possibly to look at figure 3, but that shows the results for overall quadriceps hypertrophy, which is the aggregate of like rectus femoris and vastus lateralis. So it's the overall result of those two specific muscles. Okay, I did run a muscle specific analysis, which we can speak about soon, but the initial one is overall quadriceps thickness, right? Now in the paper, I've displayed the raw data, which is like each participant, what was their quadriceps thickness at pre, what was it at post. You can see the line connecting the two data points there in figure 3A. That shows the change from pre to post for each of the protocols. I've also displayed the percentage change, right, of those of the raw data. The percentage change is roughly the same, right, basically identical between the protocols. And as a practitioner, I think what's important here is looking at the individual variability. Like people respond differently. So although everyone was well trained and the sample was roughly similar, we see most people cluster around the same part of the graph there if you're looking at the percentage change, but there is variability, right? And of course the within subject design takes care of that, right? It's not a confounder. Then moving on from that, we have the results of the Bayesian analysis. So again, this is where we see the probability distribution. So we're seeing the for the likelihood of different outcomes. And there's in figure 3, there's two different probability distributions. So I'm going to try my best to explain the difference here. In figure 3C, we see change in quadriceps thickness, and that's the within protocol difference. So this is showing the magnitude of effect in each protocol. So how much did their quadriceps thickness actually change across the intervention, right? The magnitude of that. And for each protocol, RIR and fail, you see an individual probability distribution. And visually, you can see that they basically overlap and they look very similar, right? And as a practitioner, you look at that and you make your own inferences from it, right? I think it's more informative than just a p-value that says there's no statistical difference between two conditions. Now, in that graph, there is a shaded gray area, and that represents the area that exceeds the error margin of the ultrasound assessment. So those probability distributions, they live in that gray area, which means the change in quadriceps thickness that we observed is likely due to hypertrophy and not error in the measurement. And again, that's visually observable in the graph there. Now, to give some insight, for figure 3D, what we're looking at there is the between protocol difference. So now we're just comparing the two protocols and we're looking at the probability of the outcomes either favoring RIR or fail, right? And I've used colors to try and color code it there. So you can even look at that probability distribution. You see that the area on either side of the zero is equal, and the amount of color on either side of the zero is, right, it's equal, it's roughly equal. And the interpretation of all that is that the quadriceps hypertrophy between the protocols is expected to be roughly similar if you fit the rough sample. If we're assuming that the population is a normal distribution and you fit the rough sample studied, you're going to expect to see similar hypertrophy doing either of those two protocols, right? And when I say protocols, I mean literally if you're doing the leg press, the leg extension, using similar rest periods, proximity to failure, etc. Okay, so the given data shows similar quadriceps hypertrophy, and as a practitioner or an individual who trains, you can look at those graphs and try to apply them in the context, of your own training or your client's training.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
Yeah, I think well explained and run through those graphs. I think again, when you look at it, they do almost just look identical. Like when you just visually look at it, it's very similar. Actually, something I hadn't mentioned, because you talked about kind of, hey, if you're doing this protocol and you're fit the criteria in terms of you're a similar resistance trained individual. I think there was 10 to 17 sets was like the range that participants ended up doing, which I think, when we think about the evidence-based recommendation of that maybe 10 to 20 that a lot of people quote, it's landing within there. So again, it just kind of adds a bit of additional ecological validity for me, at least, again, programming for my clients. If anything, for quads, that's maybe slightly towards the higher end, if anything.
Yeah, well, it's important to know, remember, the sample was made up of males and females, right? And that's something we're not really speaking about, but we might in the future, because I will be doing a sex differences analysis on all of this to see if, and that will form another paper, right? So that will form another discussion. But the females, if you look at that graph, the quadriceps volume for the females was a little bit higher. So it ranged from 12 to 17 For the males, it ranged from 10 to 14. And those numbers are based on the 20% increase, right? So towards the end of the intervention. But I think I stated in the paper that, yeah, the results seem to be stable across that range of sets. So again, if that's how many sets you're doing, you can, again, use that to make it fit into your own context.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And the sex differences, I mostly work with males almost completely. So that makes sense. And that's much closer to the numbers that I would be thinking about too. And to think they were after 20% increase too, again, just adds extra validity to it as well.
Yep. So moving on from the overall quadriceps thickness results, the next step is to look at the muscle specific results. So this is where I look into rec fem and, vastus lateralis and see if there is an influence based on the actual muscle being measured. Now, we did pick up differences here. We saw some differences, but they are small. So that's something to keep in mind. And we're not 100% confident here if these differences are likely due to differences in hypertrophy or just minor measurement error, because again, they were small, but nonetheless, there was a trend that seemed to exist, something that we can use to inform future research, right? And for now, we can think about as to why we might be seeing that trend, but we don't want to be putting too much stock into it. So if you look at figure 4, you'll notice that the probability distributions, they actually look a little different, right? They don't overlap completely. And if you look at the between protocol differences where we're comparing fail with RIR, you see that there's more color favoring one side of the 0 versus the other, right? So again, as a practitioner, when you understand the concept of interpreting these probability distributions, you should be able to look at that and be like, okay, there's something going on here. So what we found, which I thought was very interesting, and there is one previous study, I'm not sure if you remember reading this in the paper, Steve, that found a similar trend. So it was a study by Anderson, which was a very similar study design. So I used 2 main studies, one by Anderson, one by Santianolo. I hope that's how you're pronouncing it. I used those 2 studies to help form my study. So they're very similar. So they used the leg press and the leg extension too. They both found similar hypertrophy between fail and non-fail, or high velocity loss and moderate velocity loss. So similar, and they were both resistance trained. So we've got now 3 studies that kind of look at the quads in a very similar way, seeing similar results. Something to keep in mind. They found a similar trend, and this trend shows that the vastus lateralis responded a little better to the fail protocol than the RIR protocol. Okay, and for the rec fem, it was the opposite. The rectus femoris responded a little better to RIR versus fail. And then when you look at the overall, we see similar, right? Now, of course, most of us are going to be interested in overall quadriceps hypertrophy. I think everyone would be. But considering these muscle-specific effects feed into the overall quadriceps hypertrophy, if there is something there, then it's maybe something we should pay some attention to. So what we hypothesized was that because the leg press likely stimulates the vastus lateralis more than the rectus femoris, and because the leg extension likely stimulates the rectus femoris more than the vastus lateralis, it's possible that going to failure on the leg press, which was the first exercise, maximized hypertrophy of the vastus lateralis. But because all those participants went into the leg extension more fatigued, and you see that in the fatigue results, hypertrophy on the rectus femoris may have been compromised. So you see rep loss always being greater for fail on the leg extension, despite it improving over time, is always greater for fail, right? So maybe that's what we're seeing there. And then training to RIR, because you don't go into leg extension as fatigued. Yes, it compromises your hypertrophy initially by a little bit, but then gets you a little bit more on your subsequent exercise, right? So that's what we hypothesize. Again, there is some slight evidence in favor of that trend from previous research. But what I'd like to see from here is more studies looking at that specifically. So is there influence of exercise order here? and carryover fatigue that we need to account for? And one thing I really want to put forth here, Steve, that I think is really important. Again, this comes down to the methods of the studies. It's common to hear people say that, if fatigue was an issue, then we would have picked up on it across all these studies that, investigate hypertrophy. And, there seems to be this dose response. So why isn't fatigue influencing that? What we need to understand is that a lot of studies only employ one exercise or two. So, Steve, if you just went in and did 4 sets of bicep curls, and that was all you did for the whole session, you'd be silly to keep keeping reps in the tank, right? You want to be pushing pretty damn close to failure because that's all you're doing. So there's a study, for example, in my meta-analysis by Martin et al. It has the largest effect size in favor of failure training, right? And it kind of increases. They train to momentary muscular failure, and it really favors failure versus all the other studies. It's in favor of failure by a large extent. When you read the study, all they did was bicep curls, right? So how can fatigue have anything to say if you're just doing one exercise? Right? It might have something to say, but it's going to be very minimal, and it might not be detectable. So what we need to understand is, in practice, Steve, I watch your training on your stories, right? It's like you're doing like 5, 6 exercises, right? There's multiple exercises that we need to account for, whereby fatigue might cause an issue. I don't know, right? It might, and we don't know because we don't really see studies designed in that way that capture fatigue across, multiple exercises that are working the same muscle group. You might do a back and bicep session. You might do 3 to 4 exercises for your back and 2 for your biceps. That's a lot of fatigue going towards similar muscle groups. Now, granted, you've got your upper back, your lats, and if you do things properly, you can spread the fatigue. Fair enough. The same goes for your chest. It's less obvious in the chest that you can spread your fatigue around. So something to consider there. Right now, in this study, it was leg press followed by leg extension, short rest, short-ish rest. It was well controlled. So the carryover fatigue was there. It's not like we were resting for as long as we wanted to in between exercises. And that's another thing to take away. In practice, Steve, if you push to failure, you can rest for as long as you want. No one's there timing your rest. And that's fine. Like that, you can train like that. So again, I'm not here to give these study findings and tell people what they should be doing. It's like, it's up to you I can give you suggestions and I can speak to you about the frameworks and models that I employ to make decisions. But at the end of the day, you can take control of your training, and there's many ways you can slice the training cake. As long as you're doing things that run by certain principles, you're probably going to get good results. So if you want to push to failure and rest for, 7+ minutes, you can do that and you're probably going to get a good result. But there's also other ways to go about it, right? Many people get results not doing that. So that's the way I look at it. I have a certain coaching philosophy that I tinker with over time, that I adapt, and that I think is versatile across all the different people that I train, all the demographics that I train. And, I try to use research when possible to inform that. But you have to be able, if you're looking at the research and trying to make something of it, you have to be able to distinguish between this is what happens in research, right? And this is what happens in practice, right? Many studies might only use 1 or 2 exercises. In practice, you might have a program that has like 7 or 8 exercises, right? Especially if you're training like maybe 2-3 times a week, you might do more in each session. That's just a simple example. So I know I got a bit carried away there, but I think that's just so important to hammer home.
Yeah, I think that's actually really cool you brought that up, because again, on my research for this, I did see a comment pop up in your Instagram, and they did bring up this exact point where they're like, hey, how come we aren't seeing this come up? And then you made the point of, well, research studies aren't doing full body training programs most of the time. I was like, wow, I've never thought about it like that, but it makes complete sense. It's in some ways similar to when people think about the Zach Robinson meta-regression and favoring failure versus RIR. It's like, well, the majority of the papers in there were not at volumes or frequencies that the majority of listeners are probably doing, or competitive bodybuilders are doing. So it kind of changes your reference, and how useful is that kind of result there, and why are we seeing what we're seeing? So I think that was really well explained. And the fatigue thing is definitely like, I don't know, anyone can think of doing deadlifts. I remember, I don't know how many years ago it was that I was doing deadlifts off the floor. It's a while ago now. And I just remember doing them, and I was like, maybe I tried 2 sets and then I was like, maybe I should just do 1 set because these are really screwing up the rest of my session. And now I just don't do them because
it just takes so long.
Yeah, they take ages, and to get a productive session after them, it's just like you feel that fatigue. It's actually interesting.
Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting in terms of the growth differences here, because from my understanding, I thought it was fairly well established until I looked into it. The exercise order has shown to influence hypertrophy outcomes, i.e. do something earlier within a workout, you get more growth than later. But from looking into it, it looked like it impacts strength, but not so much hypertrophy. So it looks like there's an area that maybe needs more research, because I think at least practitioners really use that. And I think gym goers do, or competitors or physique enthusiasts, we do. But in the research, at least, it hasn't been well elucidated from what I gather.
Yeah, it's always interesting to hear people speak about certain ideas as if they've been very well researched. Proximity to failure is one of those. One of those topics that this is the first study to employ RIR prescription and get people to predict their RIR in the training program and look at long-term hypertrophy outcomes, right? Based on what you see on social media and Instagram, it wouldn't come across like that, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And yeah, exercise order is an important variable. Like that's something that I am often kind of using across like mesocycles to make adjustments to the program, and something I consider. So yeah, it'd be good to see future research look into that.
And you've mentioned, we've looked into the growth now. You mentioned fatigue as part of this influence. Okay. I think that might be a good place to move to.
Totally. So I conducted a study in 2022. I'm starting to lose track of time, but I believe it's 2022, that looked at the acute effect of proximity to failure on neuromuscular fatigue. Now, sometimes when we use this wording, it can get a bit tricky, but we looked at the neuromuscular fatigue right after a training protocol, and then 24 and 48 hours after. So acute in the grand scheme of things, even though we looked at it in the days after, right? And the findings were that there is a linear relationship between proximity to failure and neuromuscular fatigue, and that's in line with some of the previous research that just compares failure versus non-failure. And intuitively, people know that it was cool to quantify it though. Taking the next step, in this study we used a similar method. So we looked at changes in lifting velocity and even repetition loss, okay, from the first to the final set, to try and quantify that acute neuromuscular fatigue over time, so across the intervention. So although in this case, we're not directly measuring neuromuscular fatigue, because doing that is quite complicated. It's very hard to have the machinery that allows you to do that. Although we're not doing that, I think the measures I've used are quite practical. So especially repetition loss, that's something that you can calculate on a spreadsheet if you really wanted to, or in your training log, and even lifting velocity. It's just like understanding that as reps get really, really slow, like fatigue's going to be higher. So I think they're both practical measures that we employed. And what I was trying to investigate here was the trend over time, because that's what people are interested in, right? And that's the common idea that gets conveyed, is that over time you adapt to the training stimulus, okay? It's not the repeated bout effect per se, because the repeated bout effect is more so specific to muscle damage. So over time you experience less damage from the same stimulus, although as people who try and train hard and progressively overload their training, although the exercises are the same, like the stimulus is probably getting greater and greater each week. So it's not the exact same stimulus. In studies, it's literally they try and do the same thing. But anyway, it's more so fatigue resistance over time. So an improved intraset fatigability. So I tried to investigate that across the time period, across the 8-week period. Lifting velocity loss was measured in weeks 1, 4, and 8. But the thing is, with repetition loss, we had data for every set throughout the whole protocol, intervention, I should say. And we've plotted that in one of the graphs. So if we start with lifting velocity, we'll see that across all the weeks measured, lifting velocity loss was always greater for fail versus RIR, less so in week 8. So it's a slightly smaller difference in week 8 between the protocols. Again, looking at the individual variability there is so important. So this is why I in all my research, I try to present the individual data points, because I think for practitioners, looking at the group mean is one thing, but looking at the individual response is another. Again, whenever you're trying to build that bridge between research and practice, it's like you have to look at the client who's in front of you. If you're a coach, it's like that gives you the most information. If you have somebody who just, presents like a machine and their rep loss, there's no rep loss, and they can do lunges until, until the sun comes down. It's like you can program for them in a slightly different way, right? And you see that in the graph here. Now, for rep loss, this is where I think it gets really cool for some people to visualize some of the results. In figure 6, you'll notice I've actually plotted the trend. So again, if you're listening and you're interested in this, be sure to check out the paper. It's open access. Figure 6 shows the trend in repetition loss over time, quantified as a percentage, right? So on the leg press, you see that repetition loss actually increased from the first to the final set. So participants lost more reps as the intervention went on. It wasn't a large degree, and it was more so for RIR versus fail. Now, thinking through this, I think one of the reasons why we might be seeing that is because with RIR, that endpoint, that set endpoint, is simply going to change. Like, it's not always a perfect 2 RIR, right? So towards the end of the intervention, maybe it was closer to a 1 RIR. Right. And in the beginning, it was more 3. And maybe people were kind of pacing themselves subconsciously. It's like we know that's a phenomenon. Like we know people will pace from set to set. Maybe they were pacing from week to week. If you're not sure what that means, it's just basically me subconsciously thinking, hey, I've got 2 or 3 more sets here, so I'm going to pull back. Right. That might be something we're seeing here. I don't know. On the leg extension, though, we see the opposite trend. So we see the repetition loss actually decreased, which is evidence for improved fatigue resistance. And I think this is what people have been after, is like being able to see that quantified, right? So basically what that graph shows on the leg extension is that over time, from session to session, participants lost less reps from the first to the final set, which is likely suggestive of decreased neuromuscular fatigue. Now, one of the reasons why I think it's more obvious here on an isolation exercise is because the mechanisms of fatigue are more isolated. Steve, when you're doing a leg extension in between sets, let's think about what is actually going to improve your recovery in between sets. Well, it's going to come down to what's happening on a local level, right? So how well can your muscles clear metabolites? How well can they get blood flow to the targeted area and subsequent oxygen and replenishment? How well can your muscles manage the calcium flux? Because calcium plays a role in the contraction process and in overall fatigue. So there's a few local elements there. But when we try to think about the mechanisms of fatigue on a compound exercise, there's a little more to it. It's like now you have a stability demand, you've got a balance, you've got to coordinate, cardiovascular demand as well. There's a little more to manage. But on a leg extension, it was clear that for both protocols, rep loss decreased. But at all times, it was still greater for fail. So they still lost more reps throughout all the weeks. And that's what I was alluding to earlier when I said, hey, this is why we might be seeing the muscle-specific effects on hypertrophy, right, or on change in quadriceps thickness. So something to keep in mind there. And I guess that's also why the volume, Steve, ended up being the same between the protocols. So although we didn't deliberately equalize volume load or rep volume or anything like that, it ended up being roughly the same. Again, this is a standardized protocol. So in practice, you might accumulate more volume training to failure if you're resting for 10 minutes. But in a standardized protocol, this is how it played out.
It's really interesting actually to see the difference between the leg extension and leg press there, but the kind of rationale behind it being a more local fatigue, and therefore you're adapting to it. And I think, at least when I think about when I've done something like metabolite training, where it's like trying to chase that pump a little bit, I do find people, and I've heard about it anecdotally, people will adapt quite quickly to this sort of training. So maybe it's a little bit more like that. Something else that was running through my head was, I'm pretty sure the research, you'll obviously know this way better than me, as people go through sets, RIR accuracy increases. Is that right? Like typically they get better at predicting that RIR. I don't know if that would influence like anything here in terms of results and outcomes. Maybe not. I think it probably is more of that preservation effect that you're talking about, or like you're holding back a little bit because you know you've got more to come.
Yeah, those are unfortunately questions that don't think we can answer. It's like, because subconsciously, like there is a possibility that you're pacing yourself and you don't even know it, right?
Yeah. And I guess the other thing people might think about is like, oh, if we got the same outcomes here, is it because we matched, like volume load ended up being matched? Is there other ways we could match volume load and also see these outcomes? Like, I don't know, leave more reps in the tank, but do more sets and things like this. Those are just areas where I'm thinking.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, the volume load was similar. It's important, and rep volume is similar too. I mean, there were minor differences in rep volume. So between the exercises. So on the leg press, failure did like a couple more reps, and leg extension, the RIR protocol did a couple more reps. Very, very minor. But again, we have to translate that across a whole workout, right? It's always, how's that going to affect your whole workout? Because you're going to be doing more exercises in practice, right? So it might be evident that the changes in the differences in rep volumes, simply the number of reps completed, that might be more evident across more exercises. And the reason that's important in this case is because the volume load was looked exactly the same. The rep volume wasn't exactly the same. There was a bit of a difference there. And reason being is because the strength adaptations were a little different across the legs. So the legs weren't at all times lifting the same load, right? So there was a load progression strategy that was implemented. It's in the paper. When they met a certain point or they exceeded the rep range, the load went up, etc. And that was different across the legs, right? So volume load obviously takes into account the load and the reps and the sets, whereas rep volume is just sets and reps. So it's important to kind of consider that because in practice, when you're training, the load is usually the same. Like you're usually doing bilateral exercise anyway, and it's kind of the same load. So rep volume might become something you kind of keep in mind, in practice. Simply, how many reps are you losing at a given load?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's definitely interesting, and it makes so much sense that we're seeing basically what you expected to see in terms of more fatigue from hitting failure, and then it's just interesting to see that the volume load ended up being the same. But again, it's almost like based off what we previously thought is, the preservation is coming through, not causing as much fatigue in that sense. So it's just good to see those trends mapped out there. Is there there was actually, in terms of neuromuscular fatigue, that's obviously something we obviously spoke a bit about. I think the rep range selection and the specific exercises chosen to reduce kind of injury or anything like this. Did you have much to say on that? In terms of, did people pick up more niggles? Did you change your loading strategy actually? Because I think you mentioned you were like hitting the top end of a rep range and adding 5 kilos, but now you're like, maybe I'll add 2.5 because that maybe was a better change. Initially,
very, very early on, yes. So we made smaller load adjustments. In the paper, I've also reported how many musculoskeletal complaints I received. That's what I call them. They weren't injuries per se because people kept training. But they were just complaints. And off the top of my head, I believe it was like 5 for fail, 3 for RIR, but then we had an actual injury in RIR. That's again noted in the paper. Someone got injured. When I say injured, it was like just a slight strain, muscular strain, but they just weren't able to perform. They didn't want to perform. So they recovered, and then they came back a few months later and conducted the study again. So again, that's all explicitly reported in the paper. And yeah.
5 and 3 is correct. I just have it here in my notes. I've just
5
seen
and 3
it.
is correct. Good.
Yeah, that's you have a good memory. And
Yep.
yeah, I think you also mentioned in the paper where it's like, hey, if you can't do the leg press, you can make up the volume through leg extensions. That was kind of the way you kind of would work around these things. But it's good no one got
that happened
actually injured
on
apart
like,
from that.
yeah, less than a handful of times. A few times where, there was like maybe some inductor awareness on the leg press, slight pain there, maybe it was through the glute, and we just did the session on the leg extension with the same RIR, same fail. So everything was just transferred to the leg extension. So again, it's just because it's both same thing on both sides, like we're accounting for any potential differences there. But that didn't happen often.
Cool. And yeah, I think you actually mentioned it. You mentioned both fail and RIR. There was less repetition loss as you went on through the weeks. It was kind of that question of adaptation and kind of like, can you adapt to like training harder and harder? And that's something I think some people are trying to understand. I think you're also trying to understand in terms of neurological or neuromuscular fatigue. Is it something we can adapt to? And is it something we feel impacts longer term? I guess that's just a question that's still out there a little bit for you.
Yeah, totally. And I'm looking forward to seeing future research in this area. Again, this is one of the first studies that has actually looked at the long-term nature of fatigue. So it's in its infancy, this area of research, and there's different ways we can go about measuring that. Like in research, some ways harder than others. I think the measures that I use are quite practical, easy to administer. But of course, it's just one study, and I'd love to see other exercises investigated as well over time. And again, in practice, when you're coaching, it's all coming down to what you see in front of you. If you see an individual who, like, if you have a client who I have one client, he's young, he's prime time, he sleeps 9 hours a night, he doesn't have a job, I shouldn't say that, he has a job, casual job, not many hours. He hasn't endured an ounce of stress in his life, right? And he eats like a horse. He recovers, right? And he gets better as the program goes on. So, 8-9 weeks deep into a program, he's looking fine. So, what I see is how I'm going to program, and I'm going to push him harder. I'm going to feed into that. In other cases, though, I have clients who they've got like physique goals, but they've got 2 kids and they're like sleeping 5 hours a night, and they run a company and they come to the gym with a migraine, and it's like there's just so much going on. So it's always coming down, no matter what the research is showing, and how these trends look over time. It always comes down to the client in front of you, and who you are as a person. You might be training yourself, and you've got to have an objective eye on yourself, which is easier said than done in that case. But I just want to hammer home that point too.
So I don't know if this is a good time for me to kind of run through like a summary of conclusions from the study, and then maybe go into practical application. Does that work?
Totally. Yeah.
So
there's definitely more. But if you're interested, read the paper, and keep in mind that there'll be more work coming through. So, like I said, the sex difference analysis, and I also measured perceptual responses. So this is another thing I was doing, by the way, which I forgot about because it's not in the paper. But I was also asking participants about their perceived discomfort after every set, their perceived exertion after the whole workout, and their general feelings after the whole workout. For each of the legs, so remember, each leg's the starting leg alternated from session to session, and we only took those measures for the starting leg, not for the second leg, because that could be influenced by what we did initially. So there'll be more work coming out in that area.
Is there anything from that do you remember kind of was there anything particularly different between groups, or?
Yeah, in line with what you might think, but the analysis isn't confirmed there. So Steve, I'll wait for another invitation to your podcast later this year.
Yeah, I have a feeling anyone lifting kind of, how you tend to feel during those, but I'll be interested to know what the actual data says, because it's not like I collect that. All right, mate, to some extent collect it with clients, like a in-session RPE or something along those lines. Like how fatigued are you?
Basically, that's what it was, a session RPE. And I also took that across multiple weeks, so we're going to be able to see the trend.
Very cool. Yeah, I'll be excited to see that, and the sex differences I think will be really interesting. Yep. So for the listeners, just because I think we covered a lot, and I always think it's useful if I can somewhat summarize. So there was similar growth between the two groups, or the two legs, 1 to 2 RIR versus fail over the 8 weeks. Muscle-specific hypertrophy may depend on exercise selection and the order of things. It seems that could be a plausible reason for it. I think that probably makes the most sense from anything else that I can potentially think of. And so the resistance trained population that was within the study predicted RIR within a rep. There was similar volume load and rep volume found between both legs. Rep drop-off was greater for failure in general, despite that adaptation across the time. And there was more acute neuromuscular fatigue for failure. But again, that may attenuate as time goes on. So those are the conclusions from your paper. So I literally read them off. So I shouldn't have missed anything. So from your paper, and then from the larger body of literature that's available now, because like you said, there's been a lot, and a lot of it down to you. So thank you. Where do your practical recommendations lie? I love your description of when a new study comes out, it shouldn't just suddenly change your perspective completely. It just nudges you in a direction wherever you may lie at the moment. So where did this nudge you necessarily, and what are your practical recommendations looking like at the moment, Martin?
Cool. So I like to think in frameworks and principles when I'm coaching. So a lot of people seem to think that if you're a researcher or you're interested in research and you write up programs, you sit down in front of your computer and you have a stack of research papers by your side that you flick through one by one and make decisions based on the conclusions of each of those studies. Now, in reality, that's not how a good coach would operate. What we need to understand here is that there is a difference between answers in principle and answers in practice. Okay, what do I mean by this? Well, Steve, how many hairs are on your head? Now, we could try and count them. In principle, there is an answer to that question. We can try and count them, but we're probably going to lose count along the way. And in practice, it's going to be very hard to actually work out that objective answer, right? It does exist, though. That objective answer exists. And same goes for the study, right? In principle, we have a set of findings, and they're in there. They're in the conclusions of the paper. But whether they apply in practice needs to be considered amongst other factors. We need to get that straight. And because we now have so many different observations coming from different studies, what a good coach will do, right, is tie those observations down to a set of principles, right? If you don't do that, it's practically impossible to combine all those isolated observations, right, and actually derive any profit from them. So what I do as a coach is I sit down, I have frameworks, right? I have principles that I've built over time. This can look different from person to person, and I tie each of these observations down to that principle, and I feed them through the framework, right? And this allows me to consider the total body of literature in an area, and allows me to build that bridge between research and practice, right? So I don't make decisions off research per se, right? It's these frameworks and these principles that I'm using to make decisions based off. So, if we have this long-standing theory that hypertrophy increases as sets are terminated closer to failure, right? That's the long-standing theory. We don't exactly know how the exact relationship looks, but we know the trajectory. Again, the findings of this study just weaken it a little bit at the top end of the relationship because we were comparing 1 to 2 RIR with failure. That's all. The meta-regression strengthened it. These findings weaken it a little bit. All knowledge in science is provisional, so we'll wait until future research comes out and keep tinkering with our understanding. I'm completely fine with doing that. The philosophy that I employ right now is getting good results with my clients. So I'm going to believe in that, and I'm going to continue tinkering with it based on knowledge and information that I might learn from other coaches and other people out there. But for now, what I want to do is I want to present the framework that I've built that allows me to make decisions relating to proximity to failure. So this framework has 3 layers. Now, we're going to start with the first layer, which is the most basic one. And Steve, I want to start with asking you a question. When you're looking at exercises individually, like what are some features of an exercise that make you think it should be pushed closer or further from failure? What comes to mind?
Yeah, so technical demand would be one of them, or risk of injury type of thing.
Okay.
So if it's like a free weight barbell squat versus a hack squat, probably a little bit less likely to go closer to failure with the kind of free weight. Then rep range might somewhat influence it. So like higher reps, I tend to just be a bit more happy to push those closer to their lower loads. And people just generally aren't as good at assessing their RIRs with those. So lower fatigue lifts in general. So I just find lower body lifts, for me at least, when I push those closer to failure, the resulting fatigue is much greater than, say, a back movement, for example. And for a lot of people, it seems to be similar. You just asked for exercises, right?
Exercise specifically, yeah.
Exercise specific. So
even maybe muscle group, like, because they kind of they tie into each other.
Yeah, I would say more volume tolerant muscles, I'm more likely to push those closer to failure, just because of that relationship that we tend to see, where I'm like, hey, I'm going to pull more on that intensity lever versus the volume. So a back always comes to mind, especially if you consider back as just the whole back. You don't differentiate between upper back and lats and everything. The set volume can get quite high, and it tends to have quite quick recovery times, I find, for people. They don't tend to get as sore in those muscle groups versus, say, your chest or your quads or hamstrings. Upper body in general being able to deal with more volume. I feel like I've gone off piece for this question though.
No, that's good. That's good. So what you're describing there, minus the rep range and loading related factor, because that's more like a training variable, but all the other things you brought up, I'm going to call them heuristics. They're mental shortcuts. What research are you looking at to make those heuristics, to form those heuristics? You're not. You're not pulling out research papers, because there's no research paper that's going to tell you that you should an exercise whereby the limiting factor of the exercise is the target muscle at the end of the set. There's no research that's going to tell you that that's an exercise you should push closer to failure. Right? If the limiting factor of that exercise is the target muscle, push it closer to failure. Why? Well, we can sit here and speak about reasons for that approach, right? And we can probably speak for an hour about why that might be a good idea, but we're not really going to have any research to support that. We don't have any research to support that some muscles are more volume tolerant than others, right? Well, no direct research. All I'm trying to say here is that the first layer of this framework is made up of heuristics, right? So when you're looking at an exercise and a muscle group, it's like, I'm thinking limiting factor, I'm thinking technical demand, I'm thinking stability demand, systemic fatigue cost of that exercise, right? Tolerance of the muscle. Those are just heuristics that come to mind immediately that I don't sit down and read about in a research paper, right? So you can think, Steve, of all these exercises or all these features of an exercise as sitting on a continuum, and the heuristic kind of puts you on one end or the other. So you've got closer to failure on one side, further from failure on the other. And it's like, okay, if the limiting factor of the exercise is the target muscle, we're automatically going to push that one closer to failure. If the stability demand is low, though, and the exercise is unstable, maybe we move the other way, right? So it's where that needle moves on the continuum is simply a heuristic, right? That's the first layer. Good coaches have good heuristics, but they don't just rely on heuristics, right? The second layer is then integrating those heuristics about proximity to failure into the whole training program. So now we look at the training variables, right? How have you structured the rest of your training? And this is where we can look at research, because we have research on volume and on frequency and on rep ranges and load lifted, right? We have a bit on exercise order, right? Muscle focus, all that stuff. We can look at research and pull out some of those findings to integrate that first layer, those heuristics, into the second, which is now the training variables. Right. So if for whatever reason you want to train like Jay Cutler, who never trained to failure, he is recorded on many videos saying he never reached failure. He just did high volume. If you want to train like him, for whatever reason, and your volume's really high, you can pull back your proximity to failure. So you can move the needle on that continuum, right? If for whatever reason you think that a certain muscle group can't tolerate that much volume and the set volume's quite low, needle moves the other way. Okay, same goes for the load lifted. If you're lifting heavier loads on a given exercise, right, you're training further from failure, or you can get away with that. If you're lifting a lower load, though, you should probably push it closer to failure. We have some research to suggest that. So the research is now getting fed into the framework, right? So it's, again, I'm not making decisions based on the research per se, but it's feeding into the framework, and I make decisions based on that framework. Now, the third layer is the individual characteristics. Now, again, Steve, you're not going to have a research paper that gives you information about each of the clients you're working with. So you don't have case studies for all the clients that you're working with, right? But you have an understanding of physiology and some of the hard sciences. So, for example, we know fatigability can vary across individuals. That's an individual characteristic, right? We know that. Some research provides evidence for that, and physiologically, we might be able to explain that, right? And so you have to consider everything we've already spoken about within the context of that individual characteristic, right? You also have nutrition status. So we have good reason to believe that being in a surplus is likely going to promote recovery and facilitate it and allow you to do more and recover from more. So if someone is in a surplus versus a deficit, that's something I'm going to consider, right? We have sleep. Physiologically, we can explain why more sleep could lead to you recovering more from your training and pushing harder, having better between set recovery, right? Stress levels, perceptual responses is a very common one. So one thing I found in the perceptual response analysis was that some individuals don't feel too much discomfort pushing to failure. Others do. That's an individual characteristic. And some individuals might also have like sporting demands. So as people who are interested in hypertrophy, we sometimes just pigeonhole ourselves. But there's people out there who we might work with who like playing sport, who do play sport. And sports athletes should also integrate hypertrophy training into their overall routine, right? And as a coach, you're looking now at individual characteristics, which are partly based on, our understanding of physiology and hard science, some research, and just our understanding of how the human system works. And that's the third layer that really allows you to bring it all together for a client. And, that's taken me a while to kind of be able to formalize in my head. And it might sound complicated. People might say, that's just overcomplicating it, right? All you need to do is go into the gym and train hard. It's like training hard gets easier over time, right? So train to failure is something you can adapt to, but complicated thought is also something you can adapt to, right? And complicated thought also gets easier over time. So for me, when I'm writing a program, everything I just outlined there, I can compute that in like a matter of seconds. Like it's me making all those decisions at once. It's not complicated, right? It was at one point complicated, right? As I was formalizing the idea and the framework, the ideas and the framework, it's no longer complicated. And good coaches can make complicated decisions effectively in, short periods of time. That's what a good coach does, right? Complicated decisions, making sure they're effective and they're not just, stuck in all the noise and can't retrieve the signal. So that's effective and in a short period of time. And that's how you do it, right? That's how you integrate research into the whole process, right? How you build the bridge between research and practice. It's not a matter of reading a research conclusion and saying, hey, this is what I'm going to start doing now. So I'm going to start training to 1 to 2 reps in reserve only, because that's what this study found, that it produces similar results to failure. That's not the message I'm trying to get across with my study findings here. And definitely not the message I like to get across as a coach and as an educator who's trying to help coaches make better decisions about their programming.
So well put together and said. The way I was figuring what you were talking about there is, it's like learning to drive a car or something. Initially, for me at least, and especially I didn't have an automatic, so I'm trying to figure out all this stuff, and it's really hard. But then learning to ride a bike, that's the one most commonly said about, right? Like balancing was really weird and novel, but then you do it and it's just like, hey, you just jump on there and go. Mm-hmm. And it's very similar. Been my experience now coaching online for 10 years. Initially, I could only work with like a handful of clients because I was so slow and I had to pull on information from everywhere. Whereas now, like writing a program, everything you just talked through there, it's like, I've never split my kind of decision-making process into like those 3 layers that you outlined. But now, like you've explained it, it makes complete sense to me. And in many ways, I think about it, you almost talked about it as if it's like your own personal experience, the scientific literature, then the individual in front of you. And that's like evidence-based practice as a coach. So I think that's really brilliantly explained. And I think probably a lot of people listening who have been coaching a while or been using RIR and programming with it can relate to a lot of the things that you just explained and outlined there. So I've just never seen it put into like such a system, which is really nice, and good job on that.
Yeah, I appreciate hearing that. I think it's like you mentioned, you do these things and you consider these things when you're programming, and a lot of coaches probably do. But I think the next step for a lot of coaches is formalizing that into a structure and a frame. A framework's basically a structure that underlies like a system of thinking, right, and making decisions. If you have a framework for decisions that you think are important, right? So, for example, proximity to failure might be something important for you as a coach, right? Putting someone in a surplus, for example, might also be important for you as a coach. If you have a framework for each of those decisions and you formalize the things that you do, over time, it makes decision making easier, and you can tinker with it. You can adjust it. I think the issue that a lot of coaches have, a lot of people actually, not just coaches, is that because there's so many of these isolated observations out there, different study findings, right, different pieces of information. I think we might have spoken about this in the last podcast. All that information is just scattered in their heads, right? And they know roughly, right, which way to go with their programming, but they just can't make sense of it because it's scattered. So all I'm doing with this framework is I'm taking all that scattered information and formalizing it into a structure. And it's so much easier for me to conceptualize and speak about and program. I'm not getting confused when I program because I have a structure that I abide by, and I can tinker with it over time. So when new research comes out, I can just look at that second layer and be like, okay, we now know this about volume. So let me just change my, volume recommendation or whatever it might be. And that feeds into the structure. And it's not conflicting with the other observations out there because they've already been fed into the structure. They're already there, right? I'm already thinking about them, and I'm just tying in another observation, right? So because there's so much information out there and a lot of it is conflicting, you have to have a system of thinking like that. If you're interested in making good decisions, I mean, it all comes down to what you want. If you have a coach to make these decisions for you, then that's fine. You listen to your coach. And I think that thought process really encapsulates what it means to be scientific, because it is totally possible to use research to make claims whilst being unscientific, right? And I think science doesn't just encompass research. Research is just a tool that people who are interested in science and who appreciate science use to better understand topics, right? But refining your everyday thinking, as Albert Einstein once said, is what science comes down to. And you do that by having logic and having these frameworks and realizing that, science is a lot more than just the conclusion that you might come across in a research study, right? And again, that's what builds the bridge between research and practice. It's actually thinking scientifically. Research isn't just going to do that for you because it's not set up to operate like that.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, and I think we should leave it on that. I won't try and ruin now your great conclusion there. And I just want to say again, thank you for coming on, Martin. Thank you for all the work that you're doing, and I'm sure I'll have to bring you back on to talk about some of those further insights into this study. And actually, a question I had for you was just as a final one: when can we call you Dr. Refalo? When are you getting that? When's the PhD due?
I just submitted the thesis, so 60,000 word thesis, which is made up of five or six original studies that I conducted over the 3 years. So that's pretty cool to see it all come together within one big document, and it basically now gets examined by a bunch of experts in the field, and hopefully in a few months I get my pass, and then you can call me doctor. Maybe the next time I'm on this podcast, Steve.
Amazing. And if people want to, like we have mentioned a few times, that study that we've been talking about the whole time, like you said, it's free for people to access. I'll make sure it's linked below, and I'll make sure to also link your Instagram. I think is probably the best place for people to head.
Yeah,
so
that's about it. And all my research is on ResearchGate, or just find me on PubMed.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll make sure the ResearchGate there is linked. That's like the researcher's social media, is it? That's what someone else said to me. So it's perfect.
Yeah, that's right.
And then everyone can also kind of follow you and make sure to congratulate you when you are given that doctor title. So thank you so much again, Martin. Thank you guys for listening. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality, and we know how to do it, and we will help you achieve this. The Minicut movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.